Hello everybody and welcome to the Craft of Composition from the Ivers Academy. My name is Tori Longdon and I'm delighted to be joined today by the wonderful Cecilia McDowall, who we're going to be talking for the next hour about some of her compositional elements and how she puts together her work. Kathy, did you want to give a welcome and say hello and give any Zoom information before we get started?
Hi, sorry, no, just to thank you both for joining us today. We're really looking forward to it. And just a bit of housekeeping. If people want to ask questions, please use the Q&A box and Tori will have a look at that towards the end of the session and we'll answer anything that you would like to know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Great. So we started the session with one of Cecilia's pieces, The Lord is Good. And the choir you heard there was Sospiri, conducted by Christopher Watson. And the beautiful soprano solos you heard were Susanna Fairbairn and Miranda Lawrence. Cecilia, welcome. Thank you for joining us and congratulations on your award.
Thank you so much, so much. The Ivor Novello Award, a gift from the Ivors Academy, is such a special gift, and it means so much in so many ways. It's the recognition, but it's the recognition for doing something that I absolutely love doing. And also, there's something too about writing for a number of years. It's difficult to know whether it's apparent what one is doing. So it's lovely to know that the music's been heard, it's been responded to in this way. So I'm just so thrilled to receive it. Thank you.
And you've got such a wide-ranging canon of works now. How long have you been writing music for?
Oh dear.
Dare I ask?
Yeah, right. I mean, I suppose seriously, probably from my late 40s. So that's about 20 years. I came to it late. So yeah, I mean, I've always written something, and I've fiddled around, improvised, messed around with music for years and years, but it was making a decision at around about the age of 48, 49, thinking that it's time to get on with it and do it now.
Wow. And then of course we've had a year this year unlike any other. How have you been spending the time over the last few months? Have you been writing lots or have you been spending your time elsewhere?
Yeah, it has indeed been a year like nothing else, hasn't it? I've been writing some. I haven't been writing lots. I must admit, I find it really quite difficult to write, certainly in the first 6 weeks, for some reasons, kind of paralysis of creativity. And it was also combined with my family situation. My mother was in need of help. She's very old and died recently. Anyway, that aside, one of the pieces that I was writing this year was, strangely enough, a piece that was all about healing, and it's a piece that I've written in collaboration with Sean Street. We've worked quite a lot together before, and the piece itself it concerns a remarkable American woman, somebody called Clara Barton, who was a nurse in the 19th century in what do I call it? The American Civil War. And she, after the Civil War, she founded the American Red Cross. And while I was writing this piece, the whole ghastly incident of George Floyd was taking place. And I was thinking, how do I, it wasn't a self-conscious decision, but it was one thinking, there's something that's happened here which is extremely significant. Is there something I can do to bind it into principally what is a work about the American an American figure? And also I was very aware that it was a piece that I was writing for the Glasgow School of Arts choir, and they had to put it on ice, and it can't be performed until 2022. And just thinking, I had a bit more time than I thought I might. So I used a spiritual, and that raises certain issues of, you know, is this cultural appropriation to use a spiritual in this context? And it was quite useful for me to go back and see what the provenance of it was. And this particular one, which is There's a Balm in Gilead, which I think is so simple, so beautiful, has its roots in the Methodist tradition here, John Wesley, and it's thought that it was then shared by the Afro-American community in America around about the 1850s. So it seemed right for the time. The name of the piece is The Angel of the Battlefield, and Clara Barton was nicknamed that way.
So it's such a apt marriage of different cultures and different stories from both sides of the pond.
That's right. Yes, yes. And in some ways, I had recently written another piece about the Red Cross, which was to do with Jersey, and so this was just another angle, another way of looking at it.
And when you're crafting a composition like this, when you're crafting your work, you've got so many different influences and pieces of historical context and text, of course, to weave into it. How do you which pin falls into the map first, I suppose?
That's an interesting analogy. I suppose it all starts from, well, it starts from the commission, how the commissioners view what they want written, and there's all the sorry, just kill that one. Yes, so it starts with practicalities, and then it gets to the bit that I love the most, which is discussing the text and how to go forward with this. And I've worked with a number of poets, all of them wonderful, delightful people, and of course writing music, as indeed any kind of creative pursuit, is quite an isolated, solitary business. So it's lovely to have that collaboration. And yes, so it then unfolds from there, really.
So if you're dealing with a sacred text, is that a different process for you? Because obviously you've got such a rich history of that text being set to music. I'm thinking about your piece, the Prayer of Saint John the Baptist. That text is a piece that it was. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the text and then how that grew into the piece?
Well, interestingly, I mean, to answer maybe the question first of all about sacred and secular, there is one thing which I do think is quite significant. It sounds very practical, but I do think it can be quite important. If it's an anthem, say for a service, religious service, church service, I'm very aware that sometimes there's not really an awful lot of time in which to rehearse. So, I mean, something like half an hour to get everything done in, and that includes the psalms. So I suppose if I know it's going to be for a church service, I write it in such a way that I hope will be easy to pick up and retain and perhaps go back to. So I'm not looking for complexity. I'm not looking for time signature changes of great difficulty. But then there's writing sacred music in other contexts for professional bodies. That's another aspect at all, and that of course is prayer to St. John the Baptist. But just going back to what you said about secular music, I think too that there's one thing which I think is really interesting about sacred music, of course, is the acoustic. And the acoustic of any building, I think, is fascinating. It's like another instrument. And I do remember when I was commissioned to write a piece for the St. Cecilia service, and it was at St. Paul's Cathedral that year. And I remember talking to Andrew Carwood about it. And he was very, very encouraging and generous about actually using the acoustic. And I think that was the wonderful thing about St. Paul's Cathedral. It's not like anything else. I think it's something like an 8-second delay. So in a way, it was being able to relish and savor the opportunity for having that acoustic there. So, but going back to St. John, a prayer to St. John the Baptist, this was a commission from the choir of St. John's College, Cambridge, and the director of music, Andrew Nefzinger. And when we discussed it, first of all, it was to be a text that was about St. John the Baptist. And I found possibly this piece, more than many I have written, is very tightly constructed, sort of from every aspect in a way. The text of it really gave me the structure. So what it is based on two different texts. One is Guido d'Arezzo's he wrote a hymn to St. John the Baptist, and of course he's well known for as a music theorist for really creating musical notation, the staff notation, and also the solfa, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, the six degrees of the scale. So he had written, obviously in Latin, a little line that describes each of those, ut and then re. So ut is something like ut queant laxus, I think. And then the next one is responsare. So it goes up in that way. So this suggested to me a way of structuring the piece on a scale, but to structure it on a diatonic scale was not what I had in mind. So it's quasi-octatonic. So it's sort of off-center, off-key, and underlying the whole thing is a pedal A, and the organ is not continuous all the way through, but is almost continuous. And because it's St. John the Baptist, and because of the river imagery used by the other text that I used, which was from the American Trappist monk Thomas Merton, I made use of the organ accompaniment as if it were a river. So it's a river running through it. So that's a rough description.
There's so much detail and so much history packed into a work like that. How long does the whole process take? For that particular work, I know it's how long is a piece of string, but how long did it take you to weave all of those different influences into that particular work?
You know, I actually can't say. I mean, it didn't take months and months. It took a short space of time. I mean, possibly about a month, I think. But the actual text, searching the text, sort of working it out, all of that did take quite a bit of time. And in a way, I think that is time really well spent right at the beginning of the creative process of making decisions on how one's going to use the text and how one's going to give the whole piece direction, particularly if one decides, as I did, that it was going to be basically on the same note, on a tonic pedal A.
So it's a wonderful work, and should we listen to a small clip of it?
Great.
So this is a prayer of St. John the Baptist, which is performed here by the choir of St. John's College, Cambridge, conducted by Andrew Nefzinger and with Glenn Dempsey on the organ. And that you can hear that ominous A pedal all the way through underneath it. It's wonderfully atmospheric.
Oh, you know, one little thing that I had no idea of was when the 7th degree of the scale came in, and it's either C, isn't it, or T. So La Ti de ut, or yes, or C. And of course, the C stands for Sancta Johannes, and in Latin it's an I, so S-I.
I think you might have lost me there.
Right.
But I do remember learning about the Guidonian hand in academy.
Right.
That's great. So when it all comes together, sometimes you're dealing with a commission and sometimes you're dealing with do you have many pieces that you compose sort of because you have a particular idea that you want to pursue? Does it tend to be mostly commissions for you, or has it changed over the years?
It's really been commissions. So once I'd made the decision that I was going to get on with it, yes, it was really just one commission after another. There are times when I think, well, maybe it'd be quite nice just to write something else. But on the other hand, I mean, everything I write is because I want to write it, and I really love writing it. So in a way, it just sort of follows on logically. Yeah.
Apologies. I'd just like to return quickly to something you said about the actual places that you write for. For example, if you write a piece that's intended to be performed in St. Paul's Cathedral, what happens then when it gets picked up by a local community choir and ends up being performed in a small hall, or and you've lost one of your instruments in inverted commas? Does it change how the piece, how you think of the piece, and how is that for you to hear it performed in a really different acoustic?
Well, I think however one writes it, it has to work anywhere. So by picking up the St. Paul's Cathedral acoustic, I suppose what I'm doing there is I'm savouring the acoustic and enjoying having it there. But at the same time, I still feel it should be performable anywhere. So in some ways, it really shouldn't matter where it's being performed. I mean, it's obviously lovely if sacred music can have that little bloom, that little bit extra there, but it's not fundamental. So yes.
And when you are working, to go back to briefs, when you are working on a brief, how do briefs get put together? Are there is there something you prefer when it comes to having more or less involvement in how tight a brief is before you start working?
Well, I think yes, the brief is something obviously that I and the commissioners discuss at length, and of course, once we've got all the business of where it's going to be done, how long it is, and what the instrumentation, the scoring, the vocal, all these practical things, then that's the exciting moment when one starts to explore possibilities. And what I do like to do is to put it back to the commissioners, into the commissioners' court, and say, do you have some ideas? Are there things that you specially want? Sometimes it will be something as really straightforward as something of a celebratory nature. It could be anything, or indeed there was one lovely one that I did for an American choir, where a member of the choir gave me some text, and that was good because I knew what they were after. That was a setting of Ash Wednesday by Christina Rossetti, who's wonderfully out of copyright. So along with the Bible and Shakespeare, not to be forgotten. So that's a nice way. But the way that I really love working on this is working with different poets. And as I've mentioned Sean Street, and I've worked a lot with Kevin Crossley Holland and a number of others. And it's sometimes a matter of taking a text that already exists and passing it over to them and asking if they can put it into some kind of context. And there are a number now of pieces that I have written that have that kind of context. The one I've just mentioned, The Angel of the Battlefield, actually has Clara Barton's words embedded into it. Another one, Standing as I Do Before God, has the words that Edith Cavell spoke the night before she was executed. And somehow having something that actually comes from these people, I always hope will arouse interest and arouse a desire to find out more about this person, these events, whatever they might be.
Absolutely, and it certainly seems to be a talent of yours to dig out amazing women through history and tell their stories. And for those who haven't heard of Edith Cavell, could you perhaps explain a little about who she was and what her legacy is?
Yes, now, Nurse Edith Cavell, or I'm never quite sure whether it's Cavell or Cavell, I pronounced it Cavell for many years. She was a nurse in Belgium at the time the Germans invaded Belgium. And she was quite extraordinary. She hid allies, she hid soldiers in her hospital, in her home, and she somehow managed to get money together to get them back into Holland and back into Britain. Her undoing was probably that so many of the grateful soldiers wrote to her and said and told her how grateful they were to her for what she had done. She was discovered, and the German authorities put her on trial for treason. I think the Americans put in some kind of diplomatic representation to try and avert what was possibly going to happen to her. And on October the 12th in 1915, she was taken out at 2 o'clock and shot. She was executed. But the thing that I think is quite remarkable is the impact this had on many people. Certainly in this country, people joined up. They volunteered after hearing this. And there's also a theory that it sort of nudged America into World War I in 1917. And her name is everywhere. I think there's a Mount Cavell in Canada. I remember meeting somebody who'd said they'd been born in the Edith Cavell Hospital in Brussels. And of course, there is a statue outside St. Martin's in the Fields in London, which has inscribed on the bottom of it, patriotism is not enough. One must have no bitterness or hatred towards anyone.
Wow.
Extraordinary woman. And she even had a state funeral, which is on YouTube. If anybody wants to watch it, it's quite interesting. Not very much of it, but it's quite interesting.
So let's listen to a little bit of that work, if we may. So this is Standing as I Do Before God, and my apologies to any attendees who couldn't hear our music at the beginning of the session, but don't despair, because this is Sospiri Choir again, who are the choir that you should have been hearing at the start of the session, singing Standing as I Do Before God, and that is conducted by Christopher Watson, and the soprano soloist again, Susanna Fairbairn.
Oh
So lovely. And Cecilia, could you just tell us what the text is right at the beginning that Susanna is singing?
Put me on the spot there.
Sorry.
I have seen, I can't remember if I'm really honest. I've got the words somewhere, but it is really about what she has seen, and her, her desire to stand before God. Yeah.
I heard the text. It is not fearful to me, and she saw some pretty awful things in her time serving. Am I right?
Oh yes, yes, yes. So she was imprisoned for some time, but yeah, yes. But such an extraordinary and impressive woman who didn't flinch
Yeah.
because she felt it was the right thing to do.
Yes. And
Um,
how do you find all these amazing women to write about? Is it just coincidence?
uh, that would be nice. No, no, it's not really coincidence. I suppose every commission starts from somewhere, and it starts from occasion. It starts from a time. For example, this year, in February, the BBC Singers commissioned a really interesting project called 7 Ages of Woman, and there were 7 of us composers, and I was representing the decade of 60s, and we were each invited to choose something that was relevant to our particular decade, and I'm only describing this as a sort of, this is how my mind was working, thinking, so how can I make this very much to do with my feeling about this time. I didn't particularly want to write about what it's like to be 60, but I thought it would be lovely to find a way that would again open up something that perhaps we're not all aware of. I did realize that it was Rosalind Franklin's centenary this year, which of course has gone pretty much unremarked. And Rosalind Franklin, as many of you will know, was a crystallographer, and she discovered in her X-ray the double helix, and the double helix led to the discovery by Crick and Watson of DNA. So she was an absolutely crucial part of that discovery. The actual photo of it was called Photo 51. That was its name. And it was the first time that it was obvious when you look at it that it is, well, not obvious to me, but obvious to people who know what they're talking about, that it was a double helix. And I was born in 1951, so somehow that tied up together. But I did feel that she's another woman, perhaps, who hasn't always had the recognition, the understanding that really is something really quite important. I know much has been made of the fact that she didn't receive a Nobel Prize, but then of course you can't have that posthumously. She died before Crick and Watson had theirs.
So how did that composition then come to fruition? So we've got this wonderful idea, and what did the work turn out to be in the end?
Right. Well, here again, I was in touch with Sean Street, and he had a look at some of the scientific words and put them together again in a context. And that was quite intriguing because I suppose if you're talking about a double helix, it all already suggests certain movement, vocal movements that are sort of intertwining of ideas.
How interesting.
So, yeah, so it came from the idea as well as from the words.
So was it set for double choir, or was it just the sort of the interweaving movements of the singers? I don't know the work. I'm embarrassed to say.
Yes, it was SSATB, so it was possibly the two sopranos intertwining with each other, probably mostly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How interesting. Great. Now, moving on to, well, I suppose staying with the theme of strong women, there's a piece that is particularly close to my heart in your works, which is The Girl from Aleppo. Now, I came across this piece when I was looking for something to perform with my county youth choir, and it's wonderful work. It's so vivid, and it tells such an important story, actually. Yeah, well, I'll hand over to you to tell us about that important story, but it's a wonderful piece.
Well, the girl at the centre of it, the girl from Aleppo herself, she is astonishing, remarkable, and I think she was 15 when she was brought by her sister from Syria to Germany, and it was at the time when Angela Merkel was encouraging people to come to Germany, and the poet and author Kevin Crossley Holland happened to be in Dubai at the the Emirates Literary Festival, and he met Christina Lamb, the author and journalist, and Nujeen Mustafa, and they were talking about her experience, and he was fascinated by it. And he and I had already been commissioned by the National Children's Choir of Great Britain to write a piece, and here the brief was. It sounds a simple one, but it certainly wasn't. The brief was children in conflict. Now, that's a difficult one. But Kevin met Nujeen. He apparently said that he immediately bought the book after he had heard Christina Lamb and Nujeen talking about it, and stayed up all night reading it. And it was rather endearing because when we were at a forum together recently in Dubai, Nujeen apologized to him and said she was so sorry he'd had sleepless nights. Anyway, she is astonishing. She has cerebral palsy, but she learnt her English by watching cookery programs, David Attenborough wildlife programs, American soap operas, and she was, I suppose, what you'd call the de facto leader of her group moving from Syria through to Germany. And Fergal Keane, the BBC journalist, kept coming across her on borders, and of course they were turned away from the Hungarian border. I think they must have gone through or tried to get through 9 different countries, 3,500 miles. Astonishing story. And what Kevin has done is to take her story, and he again has contextualized it, and then I set it to music. But what was interesting for me, or what I felt was really important, was I didn't in any way want it to be tokenist or, you know, here we are in Bulgaria, here we are in Greece. I wanted somehow to try and give a feel of that sound world, and by doing that, I asked the wonderful Harriet Mackenzie, who is very good at Arab violin playing, if she would do this, be part of it. And so in a way, what I've written is kind of quasi Middle Eastern violin line that goes all the way through it. So it's for violin and piano, just that, and singers, lots of them, or however many you have. The other thing that I thought was really quite fun to do was to try and make the piano at certain times sound a little bit like a cimbalom or a dulcimer, because it seemed to me that that kind of instrument exists in different forms all through the Middle East, from Syria right through to Germany. So those again were my thoughts behind all that.
Yeah, and were you given any guidance for instruments from the National Children's Choir?
Well, literally, it was just piano accompaniment, and I asked if I could have a violin, because I thought the violin would give a different sound world and perhaps create something just a little different.
You can get away from equal temperament a little bit more.
You can, yes, and lots of slides and falls as well, yes.
So were you handed a complete libretto by Kevin Crossley Holland once he'd finished it, or did you work collaboratively with him on developing Nujeen's story into the work?
Well, we did. We discussed it a lot, and I remember when we first met, he said he had 30 pages. And of course, my heart sank a little, you know, sorry, Kevin, it sank a little because how do you condense 30 pages into 20 minutes? So we talked a lot about it in terms of how possibly it could be structured. And I think in the end, it just seemed the very best kind of structure was to have the journey itself. So in fact, it literally, he went through the book and took out all the crucial moments that impacted on her so significantly.
Well, this seems like an appropriate moment to listen to a clip of it. And the clip that you've chosen is the sort of peak moment of the journey, which is crossing over the border.
That's right. Yes, yes. And I think in this clip, there's a mention as well of how they were treated at the border, because that's another thing, isn't it? She made it very clear, we are not animals. And amongst us are teachers, professors, doctors, lawyers, and all people who really should not be treated that way. And so it's real.
So this is that movement, the middle movement from the girl from Aleppo. It's called A Lost Tribe Pushed from Border to Border, and it's performed here by the National Children's Choir of Great Britain, conducted by Dan Ludford Thomas. That's A Lost Tribe Pushed from Border to Border from the girl from Aleppo. And you could hear Harriet Mackenzie there on that violin, and the piano was Claire Dunham. And go on.
I was just going to say one thing. Sorry. I was just going to say one thing, which was I found it absolutely, sorry, having spot of difficulty here. Right. Sorry. Yes, the thing that I thought was really interesting, sorry, somebody's desperately trying to get through, I shall ignore it, is the children. Talking to the children, I thought it was really quite interesting. Sorry about this. Excuse me one moment. They didn't really know very much about the situation, and I thought the thing that was very impressive was they were so interested and wanted to discover a lot about it. And it really, I mean, it really raised, yes, the children's choir, and it really raised, I think, a real sort of interest in everything. So yeah.
Did you get a chance to workshop the piece with the children's choir whilst you were developing it? Or was it just a case of writing it with those particular forces in mind?
Not really. Sorry about this. Yes, I think. Sorry. Having a few difficulties there.
These things happen.
I'm being chased. Yes. So the thing that was really interesting, I think, was actually just being there and talking with them and discovering how they how they felt about it. So that was really quite special.
But
Yeah.
they didn't actually get to sing through any of the work before they had the finished thing.
No, so it was all written, and
Mm.
actually that is quite a difficult thing, isn't it? If you're writing, where do you? It's easy to actually take it and then discuss it once you've written it. Although I have actually written something for the RSNO where I did work with community choirs and we did exchange ideas before I actually started writing. So that was a really interesting experience. And I got a lot of feedback there in ways that meant that I could incorporate some of the ideas that came from the choirs that I worked with. So that was, yes, another experience.
And when you're writing for a group that you don't know and that you haven't heard before you write for them, is that a particular challenge? Is there anything in particular that you bear in mind when you're writing for particular groups?
Well, I suppose what I will always try and do is to listen to the choir first somehow, either go to a performance or meet them in a rehearsal or hear them somehow, and that I feel is really quite important to have an idea of their sound and what they require. But that's really specifically geared towards the commission itself, because what I do feel is quite important is to be able to write something that will be useful for everybody, that it's not just specifically for one choir.
If you're listening to a group that you're writing for, what kind of things are you taking note of in order to inform your practice?
Oh, that's a stretching question. Well, yeah, that is a difficult one to answer. I mean, I suppose with an amateur choir, I'm always very aware of finding the note. How easy is it to pick up the note? And I know from having sung years with amateur choirs and less amateur choirs, that where you get your note from is essential to feeling confident that you know what you're doing and that the entry is a good sound entry. So I do. There are certain things that I am very aware of that I do try to do, which I hope will be useful to choir. And the other thing, I've said this before. Sorry, I've said this before, and I know it does sound a little bit strange, but always when I'm writing, whatever it is I'm writing, I do actually sing the parts through, because I like to know how it lies on my voice. If I feel it's lying well, it has, it's the line. I'm interested in the line. I'm not so much interested in the vertical, although I am in the sense of the harmonic vertical, but I do feel I always want to give a singer something that is pleasing to sing, satisfying to sing, not necessarily not necessarily easy, because one always has to challenge. But I do think that seeing something through beforehand can iron out some problems at a later stage.
I agree. And speaking as a conductor, it's one of the things that is so enjoyable about singing music written by people who think about these kind of details is that it just makes it so much more intuitive for singers to perform, and they can get in touch with the music so much faster. So I, for one, as a conductor of amateur choirs of various skill levels, I'm grateful for you taking the time to think of all these details and compose in such an aware way that means that we can reach the music much faster.
Well, that's all good to hear. Good, yeah.
Something I've noticed, and when we spoke a few days ago, I remember we picked up on it, was the idea of light and shade. So many of the stories that you've told us over the last hour have been full of hardship and adversity and challenge, and yet some of your music, such as the piece we're about to hear next, is joyful. And do you feel like you need to or want to get a sort of balance of light and shade in everything you write, or do you move from one to the other?
I do think the world is made up of contrast. It's made up. We live in a binary world where we have darkness and light and night and day and tension and release. joy and sadness. So I think that one is very much directional to the other. So I feel that they do go together. I also feel that within a piece that it must have direction, it must have some kind of contrast. It can't be unmitigated gloom. It needs some kind of arrival, maybe. And in the case of, I think it's the next piece we're going to play, Oriens. Yeah, in the case of that one, and I think the text is so interesting of that one because it is about the effulgence, the radiance of light. It's a beautiful, beautiful O antiphon. But at the same time, there is right at the end, there is the shadow of death lurking over it. So in every brightness and radiance and luminosity, there's also what is waiting in the shadows. And I think that the text of that sums it up beautifully.
Yeah. So we're going back to Christmas music to round off our session today, and before we go on to answer just a few questions. This is Oriens, performed by the choir of Merton College, Oxford, and conducted by Ben Nicholas. And this is a great chance to start loading the Q&A box with your questions, and we'll move through as many of them as we can in the last 10 minutes of the session. So here is some lovely music for you to do whilst you think of your questions. Just hear the harmony turn to the sunny side just at the end of that clip.
Oh.
Yes, great. Okay, so I've seen some questions come into the chat. Cecilia, shall we move on to answering some questions?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I'll try.
The first one's coming in from Sarah McQuaid. Sarah says it was tremendously encouraging to hear about your relatively late start as a composer, because she's applying for grants and competitions, etc. And she's often seeing that they're limited to applicants under the age of 30. So could you tell us a little bit more about how you made your move into composition and where those first commissions came from?
Well, let me think. Yes, when I was in my 40s, I did a master's in composition. So I think actually that was a great help, because one of the things I realized, of course, is when you're at university, when you're at music college, you have your peers who then go out and they perform, and very often they can take your music with them. But of course, by the stage, I'd been teaching for many years. I taught it secondary schools, Trinity College, and other places as well. So and also had a young family too. So it's I realized I needed to do something in order to kickstart, I suppose, that way. And it was, I suppose, just chance that I met some performers. Catherine Sturrock of the Fibonacci sequence very kindly invited me to be a composer in association, so I wrote for her instrumental combination. That was terrific. And then George Bass invited me to be composer in association with some choirs. So all these things help. And then, of course, once the music is performed and gets out, I think other people hear it, and I think that's all part of it growing gradually. Yeah.
And a tremendous
Luck.
and a little luck, did you say?
No, I'm just saying good luck to
Oh.
Bob. Yes, yes.
Yes.
No, just persevere, keep at it. Yeah.
Yeah. And Frankie Williams is asking, is there a piece that you particularly want to write, but that you haven't had the right moment to do so yet? Is there something sitting in your notebook?
Yeah, but I think yes, I'll keep that to myself for the moment, I think. Yes.
Classified information, Cecilia.
Yes.
I've got a question here from Rebecca, who's interested in the start of composing a piece, how you decide on how you're going to build it melodically and harmonically. Do you consciously decide to use a specific technique, like we were discussing in the Prayer to St. John the Baptist, or do you sort of write in a flow and then add things in afterwards?
Well, that's a thing. I mean, you know, the composer Henze said something along the lines of every piece you write is like starting from scratch. It's like starting from the beginning. And I sometimes think back to classical times, Baroque times, think, well, you know, you had a style then, so one could write within that style. Now we have to have our own voice and make decisions. So it's I suppose it's a way of trying to make each piece have its own distinct character, and that I have to admit, you know, that those moments right at the beginning, it's like looking into an abyss, trying to really decide what which way to go. Really, I remember the composer John McCabe saying something which I thought was quite interesting as we've been talking about DNA. He said that he felt the first few chords or the first moments of a piece were the DNA of the whole piece. And I think in a way that has a certain logic, doesn't it? That organically things start from that moment. And I feel there's no doubt about it that when you're writing a piece, that the more you write, the easier it gets because the more material you have. But of course, it's a matter of, I suppose, being economical with the material you have so that you don't have too much. As to how one starts, I mean, I find I do an awful lot before I even get anywhere near the piano. I will admit it, I do use the piano. I'm not like one of these composers who do it all in my head, but I do find the piano a very important reference, but come to the computer at a later stage, because I find if I put anything on a computer, I find it quite stifling. It doesn't seem to have the same creative freedom as it does if I'm just using manuscript and pencil. So and I suppose taking something like a prayer to St. John the Baptist, that it wasn't conscious, it just emerged as an idea. And I think very often ideas emerge. So I don't know, would you call that empirical approach? I'm not sure. Yeah, starting from an idea, working on it. I mean, I think that discarding things that don't work is also quite important, isn't it? I can't remember what Samuel Johnson said, but he said something along the lines of discard your pretty ones or something. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? Being ruthless about something, moving it out of your work if it's not really there for a very good reason, or if it's prolonging something that doesn't need prolonging. So
do you find that you've got more, what's the word, sort of organized with yourself? What's the word I'm thinking of? As have you become more disciplined with how you do that as you've continued your career?
don't know. while I become more disciplined. I mean, I suppose I have a clear idea of what I'm doing, or at least what I'm trying to do. So it will be, I have a plan and I try to execute it. Yeah. But it's often a bit shaggy around the edges because sometimes it can take time for it to work, and there are other times when I can write something very quickly. So there's no guarantee, unfortunately.
Yes.
No.
It's amazing. Sarah has very kindly put in the chat that the quote I think you're looking for is "kill your darlings."
Oh, kill my darling. That's the one. Yes, not pretty ones, darlings. That's right.
Yes, I'll have to remember that.
Yes.
I think we've got time for just one more question. It's interesting for a question from Dennis. All of your instrumentation, whether voice or instruments, is organic, real life instruments. Have you ever dreamt of venturing into the world of the digital and using software instrumentation or electronic instruments?
When I was doing a master's, I was also doing a film course as well, which was all digital. Yes, I created film scores, digital film scores. It was an interesting experience. I enjoyed it, but in the end, I felt that I'm more interested in writing for acoustic instruments. It's probably just my I mean, I have to admit it, I'm totally technically inept. So it could well be that I just find these things really very difficult when it comes to digital technicalities.
But we are really looking forward to, somebody has just said in the chat they're looking forward to the piece which is classified. And I'm certainly looking forward to seeing the results of the work that you've been doing during these last few months of isolation. Cecilia, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you this evening, and congratulations again on your Ivors Award. I hope that we will have a chance to make music again once the world returns back to normal.
I do hope so. Yes, let's get out of this devastating phase. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you to the Ivors for hosting this. Unless if somebody's going to jump in and say goodbye, I will wrap up and play out with a final piece of Cecilia's music, which is "Oh Sing Unto the Lord," which is performed here by the Oxford Choir, conducted by the one and only Bob Chilcott, and with Richard Pearce on the organ. So thank you everybody for joining us, and I hope that you will drop into another of the Ivors Academy webinars at some point in the future. Here it is.